All right, welcome everyone to the second day of Howard Days. Everybody having a good time? Hi. All right, we're going to kick things off today. We are celebrating the 90th birthday of one of Robert E. Howard's greatest creations. No, it's not Conan. It's Solomon Kane, one of my favorite characters. And one that really doesn't get enough attention, I think. Solomon Kane was, in some ways, probably his first big hit.
Yeah.
But he came out. He wrote Call earlier, but Solomon Kane was published first. And so we're gonna delve into this character a little bit today. So let's kick off the panel here. Well, why don't we let all the panelists introduce themselves, and we can start at the end. And I'm going to pass this mic on to Patrice. You guys carry it away.
Thank you.
All right, I'm Bobby Derie, independent scholar. I compiled the index of collected letters of Robert E. Howard, among many other things.
That's okay. My name is Gunther. I am associate professor at the University of Tokushima, Japan, where I'm trying to convince Japan's finest of the awesomeness of Robert E. Howard.
And I'm Patrice, Louinet, the Frenchman. I did write a few articles about Bob Howard. Most recently, I've completed the writing of the Howard Guide for the American market, and I'm completing my PhD dissertation on Bob Howard at La Sorbonne in Paris.
I'm Karen John Kohoutek. I'm an independent scholar from Fargo, North Dakota, and you would think that would be like a long way to come to Cross Plains, but not on this panel.
No.
Not at all.
So we're going to start with the history of Kane, how Bob created the character, and then we're going to discuss the character himself. So in the fall of 1927, Bob Howard made a pact with his parents, and they wanted him to have a regular job, a 9-to-5 job, and he didn't want that. So the pact was, you let me try to write and make it as a professional writer, and you give me 1 year, and if in 1 year from now I have not become a professional writer, I will do whatever job you want me to take. So what he did, he rewrote The Shadow Kingdom, which is, you may know, the first King Cole story, and a few weeks later, in January 1928, he wrote Red Shadows, the very first Solomon Kane story. So what he does when he sees that story, he sent that to Argosy. Argosy was one of the better paying pulp magazines at the time, and the editor rejects the story. But he sends a 3-page letter explaining why he rejects the story. He tells Bob, it's not possible, you can't write that. I mean, you can't have part of the story in France and the rest in Africa. You can't have the character go to Africa without explaining us how he goes to Africa. You can't have an unexplained history. We don't know anything about your character. You can't do that. So what Bob does, he doesn't change a word. He sends the story to Weird Tales, which immediately grabs it and publishes it 8 months later in the August 1928 issue of Weird Tales, which incidentally contained the very first professional story of one guy named Tennessee Williams, which is why this issue is very hard to come by and very expensive. And so Solomon Kane was created. Okay. Thank you. Do you have any questions?
Let's talk about the game.
Yeah.
It's really important to harp on this. Series characters were very uncommon in Weird Tales, but they did have one very famous series character in Jules the Grandin, and they later on got a couple more in Dr. Satan and the rest of Robert E. Howard's series characters. But this was his first hit. And the thing about a series character is it gave you an opportunity to build an audience in Weird Tales. And Weird Tales was the fans' magazine, basically. It was very unusual at the time to just have a chance to write in and get the reviews of the fans, writing back on what they thought of the stories, how much they loved the authors, and Solomon Kane was a pretty big hit. How do I put this? All right. All right. A lot of the things you would later see Robert E. Howard do with his other series characters were first developed in the Solomon Kane stories. He was figuring out how to write a series character and developing it on from there. So he's really sort of a precursor to a lot of the series fiction that Robert E. Howard would go on to write.
Oh, well, someone asked me last night if there was anything in the letters where he ever talks about his inspirations or origins, and offhand I couldn't think of anything, but I was like, well, Patrice and or Bobby will definitely know that, so.
You want to answer that one? Okay.
He mentioned that he had come up with Robert E. Howard came up with a lot of characters as a young man and continued to come up with them through his life, but the figure of Kane as a duelist at that period in the 17th century was something that came to him, I think, fairly early, but you could probably talk to that a bit more than I can.
One thing I remember is a letter he writes to Charles, I forget who it was, in 1935, and he said he probably was inspired by some of those duelists from the 16th century. He doesn't even know where his inspiration for the character came from. And that's what Kane is all about. Even Bob doesn't know who his character really is, and that's what makes him so fascinating a character, in my opinion. When you read the first Kane story, Kane is not someone who is out to kill the bad guys. He appears, well, it's more of an apparition than an appearance. Something bad is committed. A girl is raped, a girl is killed, and then Kane appears. That's something makes him appear out of nothing, out of the night, out of whatever. And so he spends the whole story trying to right that wrong, and then he disappears out in the night. He is a force, much more than a character. And if you read the stories in Red Shadows or in The Moonless Girls or Blades of the Brotherhood, the synopsis of the story is always the same. It's Kane is confronted to someone who is his doppelganger, his evil twin. And Leloup, as a French name, is the bad guy, of course. Yeah. Or it could be the German guy, in Black Mirror.
Yeah, we do that. We are pretty much into that kind of stuff.
Yeah, we are.
Yeah, but I should also mention that actually Kane is the king of one-liners.
Yeah.
That's definitely like, man shall die for this. If you don't get hooked with that one, then you don't have a pulse. No, that was definitely, it was the first story I ever read by Solomon Kane, and it was just like, okay, nice, dying girl, and this one-liner, that was the one where I just said, okay, I need to read more of that.
Yeah, I can understand that. In Red Shadows, Leloup is pretty much Kane's nemesis and is his evil twin, because when you read the story, they are described, they look alike, and they are almost similar in every feature, of course, except that Leloup is the evil guy and Kane is trying to right the wrongs. When you read The Moonless Girls, in The Moonless Girls he is confronted to an evil woman named Nakari, and Kane, K-N, and Nakari, N-K. She is exact opposite of his name. She is his evil twin in a way because she's a woman. And in Blades of the Brotherhood, he appears at the beginning of the story after a duel on the beach, and then it's George Vanway and Jack Arlinser fighting for a girl. She's wrong, and then Kane appears out of nowhere. And the guy is his doppelganger once again.
Let me just make a moment here on the swordplay, because it's very clear throughout the stories that Solomon Kane is a duelist, but Robert E. Howard grew up at a time and in a place where he had no access to formal education in swordplay. He was never taught fencing. It doesn't appear that he had any books on the art of swordplay, but he did pick stuff up, and he had a modest sword collection of his own, which he tried to learn things by doing and managed to skewer his friend's hand in the process. But he paid a lot of attention to what he could. I think he got a lot of it from the pulps, and he got some of it from some other his storybooks. But there's a great moment in The Blue Flame of Vengeance where they're having a dagger fight. And the thing that always gets me is how they're holding the sword.
The knife.
Well, he
was the evil guy.
he starts off talking about how the bad guy does not hold the dagger like this, because this is only for special situations, because you can only really stab a few ways with it. It's a good one for stabbing, but it's not the great. Now, the bad guy's holding what we'd call a hammer grip, you know? But Solomon Kane is holding his dagger like a fencer. You know, so he's got the thumb along the back for support, and he's, fending off and parrying. And then they come to grips, and the bad guy grips his hand. So he reverses what he's doing so he can pull it down, and the guy's struggling against him, and he's stabbing it inch by inch into the guy's chest. And this is the special situation that he just talked about a couple paragraphs ago, is, oh, you only use this a couple times. But that's the kind of great attention to detail that he sometimes put into his fights, which, again, he wouldn't have seen any of this. He would have maybe gone to the movies and seen Errol Flynn spinning a épée or something, but he didn't know much about actual rapier combat, but he did what he could with what he did, and he put it into his own action-y style. And it's kind of really interesting because he spent so much of his fights in Africa instead of just against other swordsmen. So it's like rapier versus spear, rapier versus axe. And Karen, I know you like his African adventures.
Yes, I do, very much. Yeah, I wanted to make sure before we left this story that this story contains to me, which is the crux of what I like about Solomon Kane and what I find so fascinating about him, is the fact that he has zero relationship to this girl. He doesn't know who she even is. She is a complete stranger, and in many of his adventures, certainly the African adventures, that, like the one with the Wings in the Night, he just kind of comes across these people and ends up in this horrible, bloody, fight to the death to protect these people who are complete strangers to him. And that idea of him as this elemental force who just kind of goes around. There's like the hero, wherever there's a person in trouble, I'll be there. Well, Solomon Kane really literally is that person, because he's not connected emotionally by any other pre-existing ties. He just like comes into a situation, and here's this person who's been wronged, and he's like, I will dedicate my life to making, to bringing this person to justice. And you're like, who would do that? And so much fiction is so overdetermined with why people are motivated to care about other people, and there's none of that with Kane. He just cares about these people because they exist.
Lulu is foe in Red Shadows doesn't get it. Why did you do that? Why do you do that? Why do you keep pursuing me, going to Africa just to kill me? Did you know the girl? Nope. I don't get it. Is there any money involved? Nope. I mean, no one can understand it.
No, actually, you mentioned that Kane pops out of nowhere all the time and without any motivation goes after these bad guys, and that's really striking. And I think what I also felt is really striking about these stories is the timelessness about the Kane stories. Okay, we know he's a Puritan. We get some mentionings of the possible period, but who actually is this Kane? Who's, for example, walking from Europe to Africa takes quite a lot of time.
When you read Red Shadows, you forget all the other stories that came after. When you read that story, it's very much a fairy tale because you don't know where it takes place. It's the south of France. That's very vague. And then the rest is in Africa. You don't know exactly where in Africa. If you want to get the correct time frame, you can't. It's impossible. Maybe 1400, maybe 1500. There's no way to know. If you try to understand who the characters are, they are Le Loup, Le Rat, the rat, Lamon. These are not names. You have the hermit. And they live in a house in a small village. It's just like the setting of a fairy tale. Martin. John?
Yeah, actually, as you mentioned, you have no idea where it is. Personal note, Rattle of Bone, the story, plays in the Black Forest, which happens to be actually my hometown area. Yes. And they actually have pretty cool places, like there is, for example, a valley which you outside of Freiburg City, which you have to pass, and it starts, the valley's name is actually Hell's Valley, Höllental. And if you pass that place, you reach a city which is called, or which translates as Empire of Heaven, which tells you how frightening that place must have been for people to pass through. And when hearing now Solomon Kane, that would be a perfect setting for that guy, actually. Rattle of Bones.
I'd like to share something with you guys. As you know, Robert E. Howard corresponded with H.P. Lovecraft for several years before his death, about 6 years. But Lovecraft, he mentioned, oh, this is a good story, this is a bad story, but he didn't normally go into great detail about Robert E. Howard's fiction until he died. And then when Robert E. Howard died, Lovecraft was writing letters to other people, and the memorials just get longer and longer and longer, and he goes into more and more depth. And he does give one big comment about Solomon Kane in a letter to Henry Kuttner from 15 October 1936. Solomon Kane reflected another side of Two Gun, the brooding ethical sense which made him furious over injustices and oppressions, how he used to storm over the maltreatment of prisoners by policemen, the high-handed outrages of absentee oil corporations in Texas, and latterly the absorption of Abyssinia by Italy. But after all, the human characters are the least part of weird fiction. REH had a strange atmospheric power, which manifested itself in more subtleties of description than even he himself realized, and which leaves in the reader's mind a menacing, mystery image of cyclopean walls in the jungle, smothered in unwholesome vines and hiding hellish secrets older than mankind. Yeah, it's very typical of Lovecraft, but it's also reflective of an aspect of their correspondence, which was injustice. Robert E. Howard very much raged against what he felt were the strong taking advantage of the weak. And Solomon Kane, as much of any of his other characters, is really the avatar of that feeling, that emotion in his writing. And again, there's a lot of things in there that would come up later in his fiction. When you read about the winged people in Wings of the Night, and then you read The Queen of the Black Coast with another winged figure that comes in the night and, you know, another ancient civilization. You might say, oh, he's repeating himself, but he's really developing a theme throughout these stories. You know, it's not self-cannibalization as much as this is a persistent idea that he develops at different times with different characters.
And you find that in Almeric as well with the evil queens.
Yeah, and Solomon Kane explains the winged guys, but in the other stories he doesn't do that. Okay, Almeric, it's aliens.
It's aliens, yes,
Yeah.
yeah, planets. But I think we got those winged beings from Edgar Rice Burroughs in the Caspak series, in which you find, the Caspak novels are three novels, short novels, and it's a story of the crew during the First War, and they arrive on the unknown continent, and they get in. It's a kind of prehistoric world in which evolution, you evolve as you go along, and at the end, the almost end of the evolution channel, you become a winged being. I forget the name they have in the Burroughs novel. The Weirus, that's it. Thank you. And I think he got that idea from that series of novels because he used the Caspak novels as an inspiration from the Isle of the Eons in 1925.
He probably got the idea from there, but he always developed it on his own. Because one of the things is that the winged beings are not the most evolved beings. They're another form of humanity in one way, and they're closer to beasts than men in some ways. And I guess this is probably as good as a segue of any to talk about race in the Solomon Kane tales. Many of the Solomon Kane tales, are set in Africa, where he's dealing with native African peoples, and okay, there's no other way to say it, he does show many of the prejudice of the era, but at the same time he doesn't. Because Solomon Kane doesn't care what color your skin is if he's going to rescue you. If it's a black girl or a white girl, if he's going to rescue you, he doesn't care. He's colorblind in that sense. There's still a lot of the white colonial, white guys are better than black guys sort of thing in there, the mighty whitey trope, if any of you guys know TV tropes. But, he was getting that straight from colonial fiction. If you read Haggard, then yeah, that's sort of a precursor to that, but he's a much different figure than Alan Quarterman, and he brings a different perspective. Everybody's equal under the eyes of God as far as Solomon Kane's concerned.
Exactly, yeah.
And I do have stuff on this, yeah, since I forgot to really talk about Africa after you gave me a nice setup. So when I think about the Kane stories, like if I think about the Derie collection, I always feel like the majority of the stories are in Africa, and then there's a couple stories that are set in Europe, and then I'm looking through it and I'm like, well, no, it's pretty much the exact opposite. So, well, not exact opposite, but I feel like the African stories are where the Kane that I really like
They
really
stand out.
comes
They
through.
stand out, really.
And his relationship with Nalunga, which the African shaman figure, magic user, who he meets, and they develop a friendship that kind of carries over very oddly through several stories, is really intriguing. And so my quote that I brought was from Footfalls Within. So in an earlier story, Nalanga had given him a magic stave with a cat head on it, and he's used it at different times. They actually had a great interaction where Kane is like, "Oh, this is all devil. So this is all Satan's doing. But I've seen you do worse." And you're like, "Well, but he's your best friend." And then in a later story, he uses the staff, and he says that at that moment he realizes that it was, quote, "not merely a tool of black magic, but a sword of good and light against the powers of inhuman evil forever." So he comes to recognize that they are doing the same thing. His cultural background has caused him to immediately assume that this African magic is some kind of satanic devil thing, which you do see in the earlier stories, but he later directly addresses this and says, this isn't this at all. This is just a different, basically, cultural manifestation of what I'm doing, which is using God, in some sense, to fight evil. And that seems like a really bolt of light in a story like this. To have that direct recognition of this sort of cultural difference, similarity, that it's not devil, he realizes he's seeing it as devil worship because of his innocence through his lens. So that's my big, thing that I really like about the African stories and his friendship with Nalanga. So.
And I want to hit on the cat stuff for a minute, because this is something that really sets apart the Solomon Kane tales from the Jules de Grandin series. If you read Seabury Quinn's Jules de Grandin series, it went on for 93 episodes, 93 novelettes over a period of 25 years, and every single one, he ends the baddie a different way. Seabury Quinn's Jules de Grandin, the occult detective, comes onto the scene exactly as he is. He never grows or changes throughout the whole series. All right, he doesn't develop any particular tool or tribute or grimoire. We think of characters like Doctor Strange as having, he's got the Eye of Agamotto, and he's got the Book of the Vishanti, and all these tropes that he develops, and these are his tools, but that was not something that was typical in series characters. And what's interesting about Solomon Kane is he develops as a character. He gets the cat staff in one story, and then in another story, he still has it. He's calling back to the previous series, and this is something that was a bit unusual. And it's also sort of interesting because he doesn't do that all the time. Rattle of Bones, we were talking about just a minute ago, it's not the same type of adventure fiction as we normally think of Solomon Kane. It's really more of a straight horror or haunting story.
Pretty much experimenting with the character. What can we do? And trying out here.
No, the kind of continuity to the African stories mostly, not the one which are set in the Black Forest or in France or wherever. When the first story got rejected by Argos in 1928, and after he got the letter from Alan McWilliams, what Bob did, he rewrote a second Solomon Kane tale, Skulls in the Stars, in which he was faithfully following what Alan McWilliams had told him. You can do that, so he didn't do that, and you need a rational ending at the end of the story. So he gave one rational ending to the story. He said the story got rejected by Argosy because it just wasn't Kane. He was trying to comply to editorial demands, and the result was a weaker tale. So he needed to be the man to write the kind of stories he wanted to tell, and so Weird Tales was very much open to that kind of experimental stories, if I may say so. With Argosy, it was pretty much, you needed the cliche tale and the cliche character, and don't move from the formula, don't move away from that.
Did you want to talk about Solomon Kane's Spoon
I would like to talk about, from you guys. Who is Solomon Kane? Now, since we were talking about that, his background is so unclear.
Who is Solomon Kane?
Who is Solomon Kane?
Solomon Kane is not someone, he's not somebody who wasn't born somewhere.
Yes.
Solomon Kane is an apparition, is someone in a way who appears when an evil crime, an evil awful deed has been committed, is an incarnation of a force, and when the wrong has been righted, it appears at the end of the story. Usually it's always a sundown thing, so it appears when the sun goes down, and it disappears when dawn is coming. At the end of Blades of Brotherhood, we had that. I mean, to see the guy is looking at Kane, and then next second, poof, he has vanished.
Okay.
Disappeared.
Okay, then we'll go for the obvious biblical Kane. Is he? Is
Oh,
he,
there's only, of course. He's a killer and a wanderer.
and is that Kane the biblical Kane?
What?
Is our Solomon Kane
Oh.
perhaps the biblical Kane?
Ah, that's a good
Literally,
question.
Really? Oh.
Yeah. Bob Howard read the Bible, so and okay, gave him some ideas. Okay, you go on.
I'm supposed to answer that?
Anybody of you guys?
I don't know, but Bobby looks like he's thinking. Not to put you on the spot, but you
All
really
right,
do. look
because
like
we've got a lot of people here, they're probably wondering what the hell we're talking about. Robert E. Howard created Solomon Kane without a in-depth backstory. He didn't write a backstory to Solomon Kane like he did the Hyborian Age essay to provide a background to his Conan and Cold Tales later on. But what he did write is something like Solomon Kane's Homecoming, which is a long narrative poem where he talks about, you know, he had the marks on his wrist from the racks of Spain, and he sailed with Drake, and you know, you get glimpses of a deeper, convoluted history of adventure, which you generally never see. You know, Robert E. Howard wasn't interested in who were his parents, how many relatives did he have. You know, he's a landless wanderer. You know, he comes onto the stage fully formed, and because of that, we don't really care about his background so much. It's more interesting as a mystery. It's more interesting to have those little tidbits and your imagination fills in the details of this guy that wanders into the scene and he's had all these adventures and here's another one and then he's gone again. And it's kind of different from what he does in Conan, because in Conan he's going through and you're actually experiencing those adventures. You know, Conan doesn't have to tell you about, oh yes, back in the time when I fought the winged gorilla. No, you're reading The Queen of the Black Coast.
Should have told that the guys who did that Solomon Kane movie.
I was just thinking that, yeah, that this is, you were just discussing last night?
Just one more mention from the letters. There's one letter to Tellis Clive Smith in which he describes the sale of Red Shadows, and he describes his character as a paranoid. That's the way he describes Kane. And I think it applies. I mean, the guy has delusions of grandeur. Is convinced that all the world is against him, or that all the world is wrong and he's right. So maybe he was right about that.
Jeff, you had an idea on that one.
On
Solomon Kane's personality.
So, on the personality? Or
Yes,
on
you
the
mentioned
origins?
that Kane is and thinks he's.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah.
Delusional?
I think
Yeah.
the Solomon Kane, I think it's,
Well.
his own sanity, I think, is intentionally ambiguous with Howard. Maybe it's unambiguous. I mean, does a rational person do the things that he does? He's, and maybe this goes back to your idea, is, because it never got answered, Dierk's question, is Solomon Kane the biblical Kane, right? Who's cursed to wander the earth in legend, right? And do this. And I think that's a great idea. And Dierk and I talked about this a few months ago at an academic conference. And you know, I don't know if Howard intended that literally, but I think certainly as an allegory, at the very least, for this concept of the you know, this figure that sort of wanders the earth, maybe trying to atone for that original sin, that idea. And the name itself, Solomon, you know, and Kane, both these great Old Testament names, you know, that is so much a part of Puritan ideology, which he represents. So in some ways, he is an avatar in a lot of ways of some of these ideas of righteous vengeance, Old Testament kind of vengeance. But I think also Howard, as he's playing with this idea, is making the reader question, is this a good thing or not? Right? I mean, because you know, what kind of normal person will follow somebody for vengeance to right this one wrong for years to the ends of the earth in order to do this sort of thing? I mean, that's not normal, right? And that's what makes Solomon Kane such a fascinating figure, and that's why giving him an origin completely robs that great mystery from this character, the ambiguity that Howard intentionally built into the character, and what makes him so unique.
I think that's on cue to talk about the movie.
And so the movie.
Okay, who wants to go into that?
Well, an unnecessary origin story, which of course is the same issue we've had with the Conan movies, which we could talk about, but we're in a Solomon Kane panel. But it's a similar problem, is that these
And-
characters both don't have real backstories.
Yes.
And they don't need them, and most of us reading
And
the
the
story
fact
don't
that
want them. There's no
we
need for
don't,
them
yeah,
at
exactly, we
all.
don't want that.
Yes, but there's an insistence that like people can't handle a character unless you know exactly where they came from, and I'm like, that's not really true.
Well, I think
But
the
it's a
problem,
big idea.
I think the problem is they did not watch Raiders of the Lost Ark. Because the thing about Indiana, now, you think about it. Indiana Jones comes onto the scene fully formed. All right, you don't need to know all of his backstory. He's a badass. He's in a temple in the jungle. There you go. Adventure
Who
art.
needs any more? Seriously.
But I will say this for the film. I'll say this for the film. It had some great actors. I always love seeing Peter Postlethwaite in anything. It had some pretty good costumes and effects, but the story was not a direct translation of anything of Howard's. You had some little pieces in there. But
It's rained a lot.
Yeah.
I have to tell this story. We were watching it, my wife and I, and she said, "Okay, now tell me the parts in the movie where it's based on Robert E. Howard books." And I said, "You got it." So we're about 15, 20 minutes in, and she says, "Is that?" I said, "No." We go to one of the big fight pieces. She says, "That's gotta be no." A little bit further on, things happen. If you haven't, I won't spoil it for you. But after a big scene, she goes, "No, that's gotta be." I said, "No." At the end of the movie, where the light is shining around him, and he's silhouetted, and the cape is billowing, and his sash is flowing. He puts the sword on, and he puts the hat on, and I went, "That right there." That's where we are. She said, "Oh, honey."
The sequel would have been so faithful.
There you go.
But that's kind of typical, because you've seen the Cole movie and the 2011 Conan the Barbarian movie, and Hollywood doesn't always want to do a faithful adaptation of anything. No control over that from Howard Scholar types.
Yeah, I would say the cull is a fairly good analogy, because the whole time we're watching it, I was just like, the only thing, if he doesn't say by this axe I rule, I mean, this whole movie is like, that's all we, and that's pretty much the only thing of cull. But I was like, they're not going to give us anything else that's cull, but they better give us that one line, those few words. And I think my husband was a little worried he wasn't going to say it, and I was just going to go off the couch. But then at the end, he says those lines, and I'm like, yeah, badly, I don't dispute that. But yeah, that tiny glimpse, that's like, okay, there's that much.
It's worth mentioning that Solomon Kane has appeared in other media, sort of famously. He appeared in comic books under Marvel Comics, where he had a brief crossover with Dracula, and another brief crossover with Conan the Barbarian, and a really strange mashup of the Moon of Skulls. And later on there was a Dark Horse series, and now
There is an upcoming board game. We need pictures, please. So, most of you, I suppose, have heard about the Conan board game from Monolith a few years back, and most of the people who were involved in that game have now set up a new company. It's called Mythic Games, and they told me last year that they were going to do a Solomon Kane board game, and they asked me if I wanted to be involved, and I said no, don't have any time to do that because I'm way too busy. And Leo Esperini, who's in charge of Mythic Games, and I'm going to show you some of the art of it, because the one guy who is going to do the illustration is wonderful. His ambition is to become the definitive Solomon Kane artist. Yeah, okay, why not? But after Jeff Jones and Gary Gianni, people like that, I said, don't trust me. Let me show you some pictures, and that's what he did. And it's working. Thank you. And so I was hooked from the very moment I saw those paintings and pictures. And he said, and this is not the best part yet, because the game is going to be a faithful adaptation of the stories. When you play one game, you play one chapter of a Robin Hood story. So you are going to play Red Shadows, you are going to play The Moon of Skulls, Skulls and Stars, but no one is going to play Solomon Kane. Solomon Kane is a cipher, no one gets it. So it's going to be a cooperative game in which you play one of the cardinal virtue. And then you will try to help Kane on his mission to win the game. And so it tries to stay as faithful as possible to the story, using only the hard description, the hard stories. And there was something else we need to add, I forgot. I'm going to show you some of the pictures. The guy's name is Guillem Pongilupi. He's a Spanish artist. He turned down a gig from Disney so he could do and work on Solomon Kane. Okay, this is a logo, and I'm told that Fred and Jay at Cabinet love it.
Love it.
Thank you. And I think it's terrific myself. And here are some pictures. So this is Solomon Kane. And of course, all this artwork is created just for the sculptors who are going to make those tiny figurines, 35 millimeters high. It's just an incredible number of detail. These are the cardinal virtues. So when you are the player, it's a cooperative game. So you play with the other players, not against one. So it's very much a family game. You can play with everyone. No one is going to become your enemy when you win. And these are the sculptures. If you're any good, you will have recognized the beginning of Skulls in the Stars, where the small boy, when Kane asked him about the road to go to Torquetown, he said, you can take the road on the right or the road on the left, and the one is shorter, but it's dangerous because of swamp, and there's Gideon and Ezra and the ghost. This is on the right hand of Doom. And this is from Skulls in the Stars, in which he fights the ghost of the brother. And that's a sculpture. That's the house of Skulls in the Stars. I mean, exactly the way I see it when I read the story. I don't know about you, but I mean, this guy is just amazing. And I wouldn't believe it at first, but Leo told me, okay, you send Guillaume a few descriptions, and I would send him a few paragraphs from the story, added a few notes and comments, and 2 days later, I would get this painting, for example. That good, 2 days. Look at that. Oh, this is the left hand of Doom. Actually, the image is reversed, so it should be on the other right, because this is his left hand, should be the right one. And look at the sculpture. That's Kane. English landscape. Blades of the Brotherhood. This is the scene at the beginning of Blades of the Brotherhood, and this is exactly it. He nailed it. Well, as far as I'm concerned. One of the pirates. And look at those figurines. They're just amazing. The guy managed, he had a Constable, if you know Constable, the painter, the English painter, Phil to them. And you're going to love the African ones. They're just, wow. Look at that. Look at that. That's Kane going to Africa.
That's King Kong's log.
Exactly, yeah, sure is. That's a landscape you have in the Hills of the Dead. It is exactly that. He wanted me to give him the exact description, you know, the hills, what the vegetation would look like. We got from the king in Red Shadows, Black Warriors, the gorilla. That's for you, Mark.
Thank you.
Lulu. The final piece is Simon is supposed to pronounce it as in Louinet. The French will do. That's from Hills of the Dead. And in that story, Kane is confronted to vampires, and actually they are zombies. But Howard never uses the word zombies for the simple reason that the word was mostly introduced in the US by William F. Seabrook in an article called Dead Men Walking in the Cane Fields, something like that. And that was 1929 to just after 1930, I forget, just after Bob wrote that story. So that's the reason why they're not called zombies. They are zombies, but he calls them vampires. Look at that. There's a throne of Nakari in the Moon of Skulls. And that's it. So if you have questions, we got 20 minutes. Yeah? Oh,
Yeah.
Scott?
I haven't read Solomon King for a long time. I read them when I was younger, but my recollection is that, and this is something I'd like your opinion about, is that there's a religious element, not just biblical, but that he's driven by, you know, a Puritan fanaticism. And where did, I mean, Bob was probably an agnostic, and I'm just, where did that come from? And it's a powerful motivator. I mean, the guy's, if he's unhinged, it's because of his fanaticism.
He thinks he's a Puritan, he thinks that, but we don't know if he truly is. We don't, in the stories, when you read the stories, you don't know if he believes in God, if Bob believes in God. We don't get to know that. It's just what he thinks. So you can think that he is driven, you can think that he's crazy, unbalanced, whatever. I don't have the answer, and no one has. Even Bob, with paranoid, he wouldn't say that he was that. And you can't read anything of Bob Hardy when you read the Solomon King stories. There's nothing of him in there. He's an English character, and Bob would never, ever write himself as an English character. An Irish one if you want, but not an English one. That's my answer.
In the back?
Yeah, I'm wondering, since it's an anniversary for Solomon King, what are your thoughts about the influence of this character on later writers and later works? One thing that occurs to me is that
Influence on later writers.
Bob Kane maybe didn't read Howard Solomon King, but Batman is an awful lot like Solomon King. And Siegel and Schuster, as Superman's authors, they were reading weird tales.
Yeah, probably.
If you had any thoughts about
Well, with Batman in particular, he started off from the shadow. So it was very much, they were both drawing from a pulp vigilante character with this mysterious past, because the Shadow went through, what, 3 or 4 origin stories, and, you know, they tried not to give him a strict identity. You know, whenever they revealed the Shadow's real identity, it turned out to be somebody, a cover. So I think the most influence you can say on it is probably the Van Helsing movie, because you laugh at this, but the very distinctive picture of the Witchfinder type character with a tall Puritan style hat going out and facing a supernatural evil, that's really what you get from Solomon Kane in the popular culture.
I agree, and the look of Van Helsing was pretty much copied from this Marvel Comics version drawn by Neil Adams about Kane fighting vampires. Forget the title there.
That was just the Solomon Kane series. It was Solomon Kane had a 6-issue miniseries, and then he.
Well, it was before that, in Vampire Tales, I think it was 1975.
Any other questions?
My interpretation of Solomon Kane is that he is insane, that he is driven insane by his Puritanism or his version of it. But if you read the stories, you kind of get the impression that what he actually lives in is this sort of dark, godless, almost mechanistic Lovecraftian universe. You get these hints throughout there that he is that he believes that he's doing God's work, but there may not be any gods to do work for. So.
Yeah, I completely agree.
That brings up something for me. I'll just throw this out here. The connections between the Solomon Kane tales and his wider universe. Everybody knows here that, you know, Cull of Atlantis and Conan technically exist in the same narrative continuity. And Cull crossed over with a Bran McMorn story, so Bran McMorn is sort of in the Cull and Conan story. So where does Solomon Kane fit in all this? Well, sort of.
In the middle skills.
Yeah.
In the Moon of Skulls, there's a connection to ancient Atlantis, and with the deities you have in the Cole stories, Valkan, Onan, together. In the Cole stories, yeah.
I want to.
That's where it's the deities from the culture.
I wanted to add one more thing to that, though, which was in the red right hand. The ring that the necromancer has on his finger is a coiled serpent ring, which is the same thing that you see in the Ring of Thoth in the Phoenix.
It's a different metal though.
Yeah, it is. It's silver instead of copper, but yeah. But yeah, it's one of those fun things for geeks that like to geek out about that sort of thing.
And of course, the Ring of Thoth does make it into the modern day in honor of the ring.
Yeah.
Right, and so, I mean, it could be because, of course, the Solomon King story was written first before he developed Solomon and his ring as a character. And so, I mean, he may have been playing with that idea. Howard absolutely was into the idea of creating what today we would call a shared universe, although they didn't have a term in those days. But he was one of the pioneers of trying to do this sort of thing, linking his characters, even if it's just Easter eggs for the regular Weird Tales readers, you know, who would pick up on these little things. You know, like we do because we're geeks, right?
Yeah.
Those guys reading Weird Tales, the hardcores, they were too, and he knew that, and definitely they fit in. You know, the Atlanteans in Pyramid Skulls are maybe a little different than Cole's Atlanteans, but he was developing this evolving shared universe as he went along, and would tweak it for the needs of the story at the time too, because you know he was still very partially oriented writer. Whatever worked for the story, he would do it. Yeah, it's good stuff.
Thank you. James?
So, if you're interested in the Solomon King board game, I have some flyers up here on the table. The Kickstarter is going to start on Monday.
On the 12th, that would be Tuesday. So it's going live in 9 p.m. in France and in the States, I don't know.
It's really high quality miniatures. It's a really cool cooperative experience. So yeah.
Comment more about it because you have a demo game with you. So can you talk about it, James? And please introduce yourself because so people will know who you are.
Jim Howard. All right. So
Yeah, Howard
last
is-
week I got contacted by a friend of his, and he said, "Hey, you want to demo out this Solomon King game?" And I said, "Sure." And they sent it to me, and like I said, it's just high quality miniatures, and we're playing different aspects of Solomon King as this cooperative experience, and you decide together how you want to kind of take on the role of that. And yeah, so like I said, these flyers over here, the Kickstarter starts on the 12th, so it's a project that I'm interested in.
Where are you playing the demo at?
We're going to play the demo at the house later on today.
And I'll be discussing the Kickstarter this afternoon in the WhatsApp with REH panel, all the specifics about the Kickstarter.
Cool.
Thank you. Any other question?
Yep.
Plenty. Yeah. Well, yeah.
I was wondering, for those readers who are sort of, I guess, OCD enough to want to insist on having a timeline put into Solomon King, I know what you suggested, it's very difficult to pin it to a particular year or era. I know that the Marvel adaptation in the 70s had an issue that once posited him having been born in 1530, but that would have been too early if he was raised in England where he Calvinist Puritan type influence to come out. Why don't we have an indication in any of the stories as to an exact date, a couple little hints where they would be written and such as that? Is it possible to even put a rough?
I think it's not possible. I think Bob didn't care about those details. He didn't want us to have a specific biography. I mean, you can read the Moon of Skulls after or before Hills of the Dead or The Right Hand of Doom. The details in there are very sketchy. Very, very sketchy. So if you want to say this tale in 1578 or 1579, I mean, more power to you, but we don't have any realistic means of determining that. And so, except for very few specific characters, I mean, when he mentions Drake, he mentions whoever, the guy, I forget the name. He mentioned a specific historical figures, but other than that, you can't say that Kane was born in 15, 7, or 32, whatever the year was. I mean, we simply don't know. And for me, the real question is, why should we care?
Yes, sir.
I was just wondering, how would you compare Solomon Kane and maybe other Howard characters to the other fictional characters that people are doing at the same time? Because I'm always fascinated when you look back at history, we tend to think that history is a straight line starting here and kind of ending up where we are now. But the fact is, you look back, you wouldn't think that we were there or we could have gone a different way with our culture. And how would you, like, we don't, I guess, when you look at Howard's characters of Solomon Kane and the other ones, and you look at what the other people were doing at the same time, what is the comparison or the contrast you would draw from his work to what those other folks were doing?
Solomon Kane came out after Tarzan of the Apes, but before The Shadow. It is basically the best way to say that. So it was before the rise of the superstar pulp hero, or the superstar pulp vigilante. But it was also a time when series characters were getting their start, when people would recognize and follow a writer and a character from story to story. I think he was very forward-looking in many ways. I talked about how he gets the cat staff in one story, and then later on the African adventures continue and refer back. And this was much less episodic. There's a lot more continuity to the Solomon Kane stories from that perspective than some of the others. But again, Robert E. Howard had a tendency to write out of order sometimes, because we talk about how the Red Right Hand, the Rattle of Bones, these aren't straight follow-ons.
It's not the red right hand, it's the right hand of doom.
Sorry,
All right.
I got Hellboy on the brain today. All right, but yeah, it's like the Conan stories were not written in a chronological order. Neither were the Solomon Kane stories exactly. But I hope that answers some of your questions. But we're really well before the superhero character era. But we're getting there, and we're getting there in part because of Robert E. Howard developing a character that develops in the story to an extent. He doesn't change much as far as personality or belief, and he doesn't gain magic powers, but he gains a magic stick, which is progress.
And of course, this can't be understated enough. Red Shadows is the birth of sword and sorcery.
Yeah,
I
I
mean,
think
as we understand it, that's, it's liminal in that we've not seen that in that combination before. There were prototypical things prior to this, but no one had put them together the way Howard put them together, and in that lightning in a bottle way that he had. So that's the takeaway. After this, we start seeing sword and sorcery showing up, and it's not planetary romance, and it's not romantic historical fiction. It's guys with swords fighting weird things. And so that's important.
What about Zorro? Just Bobby, because he was before,
it
wasn't
was
he?
1919.
Yeah, so Zorro would have been around.
Yeah. What do you want me to say about Zorro?
Zorro is a lot less weird.
Yeah, Zorro
It
doesn't
was
fight
a fox. And
Zorro doesn't fight vampires.
yeah.
I mean,
Part of that's down to the market. We'll get to inside in a second. Part of that's down to the market. You don't see a lot of adventurous, weird characters because Weird Tales wasn't that type of thing. It started out as pretty much ghost stories and a little bit of science fiction and stuff, and it developed on from there. Farnsworth Wright, who was the main editor during the crux of its run, tried a lot of different things. He worked in a lot more detective stories and more science fiction stories, whatever he thought would sell to the readers, because he was really interested in just getting the sales up. But Zorro was a straight adventure thing, and a lot of the other pulp hero characters are more straight adventure characters, maybe a little bit of spy fiction, but they generally didn't fight vampires. So I hope that answers something.
Yeah, I was just going to say, these were not weird stuff, but there were series characters that were fairly well established early in the 20s in Black Mask, weren't there? Carol John Daly.
The
it's,
the
Yeah.
international arm, was it?
Yeah, but the
I don't know.
Constant Law and the Race
Race
Williams stories
Race
by
Williams, yeah.
Daly.
They'd already been kind of established as something that was commercially successful.
Yeah, you got some in Adventure as well. You had
Yeah.
the older stuff by Talbot Mundy, Adel
Yeah.
Lamb, and what's his name, the Viking guy. Arthur B. Allen Smith. So you had continuing, well, tales featuring recurring characters, which was not, it was not a series.
Yeah.
So we had that.
I was just going to say, for me, in response to that, I thought kind of the start of Pimpernel was really the origin for most of those series superhero swashbuckler types.
I mean,
yeah.
the return. How do you call it? Return.
I don't know when that, I
Uh,
don't remember when it was
now-
written.
1905. Yeah, Scarlet Pimpernel.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Or you want to. But yeah, Scarlet Pimpernel is where you first get some of the characters in all three where, you know, who goes out and does things. Right, so a prototype more of the superhero group, because Solomon Kane doesn't really have an alter ego, so much, right? But yeah, Scarlet Pimpernel is absolutely prototype. But there's a series character, but of course the big one is Sherlock Holmes, right? The first real successful series character at that time, who sometimes delves into the weird, and then you get the occult detective that comes out of that. So the weird delve.
Well, before that, you have Ryder Haggard and the Alan Quatermain novel. You have 19 novels, sorry. I mean, it goes way.
Which Howard read when he was reading all these.
Dumas.
Alexander Dumas. I said that.
They were all-
Alexander Dumas. Dumas.
But nobody took it as cult, like the cult detective and stuck a sword in their hand, right?
Well,
And so, for the most
Somebody
part-
had to.
Jules de Grandin had a sword stick, but.
Well, that's
Ah.
true. But that's not.
Given to him by Longo.
Yeah.
No.
No? Okay. We have time for one last question.
You mentioned Tarzan. What about the influence of John Carter?
John Carter was very much planetary romance, so definitely Sword and Planet. But if you look at Sword and Planet as sort of a colonial type fiction transplanted into a more fantastic setting, that's what I usually like to think of it as, because they might be green and 12 foot tall and have 3 arms, but they're characterized very much like how they would characterize the native peoples of Africa at that time period.
It's Alan Quatermain in space.
Yeah, it's so it's a little different. Yeah. Was it an influence? Well, he definitely read it. If you read Almeric, that's his Sword and Planet novel. But on Solomon Kane, probably a little bit, but he's not the empire builder. He's not the guy that marries the queen. He'll go into a situation and he'll kill the bad guys, and then he's gone off because he's seeking justice. He's not there to build and show them the way or anything like that. He's not there to get home. He's got a wanderlust in him. So it's a very different character, Solomon Kane and John Carter. And I think that's what we got.
Yeah. Would be awesome to talk about the influence of Dumas, but let's do that at the pavilion. That's a great.
Thank you for your attention.